In the realm of heavy music, looks can be deceiving, with genres like metal and hardcore having an unparalleled level of abrasiveness in their music. So to an outsider, they may assume that the people making this music, with oftentimes taboo subject matter in their lyrical themes and darker imagery or aesthetics, may reflect this. But within our community, it is widely known that these musicians and artists are often very down to earth and kind. However, there are a few exceptions to this, as there have been some metal musicians who have been tied to some dark crimes and very serious incidents. One of those musicians is Tim Lambesis of As I Lay Dying. As I Lay Dying was a key band that helped propel metalcore from its early roots as just a more metallic style of playing hardcore to a key subgenre in metal during the 2000s that eventually became the most prominent form of the genre. Bands like As I Lay Dying, Lamb of God, Misery Signals, Killswitch Engage, and All That Remains, among others, were key bands that helped shape this era of metalcore. Being one of the earlier bands from that specific era of metalcore helped As I Lay Dying become one of the most successful metal bands in the 2000s and early 2010s. Even being one of the more successful Christian metal bands as well, as they had music videos with millions of views, sold millions of records, headlined multiple tours, and were a part of some big festivals as well. They were even nominated for a Grammy in 2008 for their song Nothing Left. However, in May of 2013, news would break that would stun the metal community and the wider public. On May 7, 2013, vocalist of As I Lay Dying, Tim Lambesis, was arrested and charged for attempting to hire a hitman to murder his then wife of 8 years. This incident left fans and journalists with more questions than answers, as it was a shock that the vocalist of a Christian metal band was even capable of something like this, even calling into question his faith and belief in God. Eventually, 1 year later, Tim Lambesis was convicted for the solicitation of murder of his ex-wife and served 2.5 years of a 6-year sentence. He was released in 2017, and a few years later, he happened to reconnect with his old bandmates. And somehow, As I Lay Dying was able to have a successful comeback. Even though there was undoubtedly demand for this, the metal community was split, as some fans were doubtful that he changed, while others gave him the benefit of the doubt. This sparked a lot of discourse around the ideas of redemption and if true change was really possible. Slowly, the members of the classic lineup of As I Lay Dying started to leave, and they were then replaced by new members. But while the band was gearing up to drop their new record, Through Storms Ahead, slowly each member left the band within a month, leaving Tim Lambesis as the sole member of the band. While this was all happening, home security footage leaked showing Tim and his now estranged wife engaged in a heated argument that many saw as proof that Tim was being abusive towards his wife, as Tim was acting very unhinged in this footage. This then sparked Tim to respond by accusing his wife of abuse, while many see the footage that leaked as proof that it was in fact Tim who was the abuser. This is a story that both highlights the highest of highs one could achieve while being in a successful metal band, and living his dream while showing just how quickly things could fall apart, even after being granted a second chance and forgiveness by your community. A complicated story that involves steroid abuse, infidelity, the disillusion and reconnection of friendships, and just how detrimental one's decision making could be for themselves, their friends, and their family. But with all that being said, I just want to say, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and all that stuff, as that'll help me come out with quality videos at a faster rate. So with all this being said, this is the rise and fall of Tim Lambesis and As I Lay Dying. Tim Lambesis was born on November 21st, 1980 in Southern California to parents Nick and Vicky Lambesis. Actually, both of their parents founded an advertising agency in 1987 called the Lambesis Agency. They had well-known international clients, which included companies like Coca-Cola, Airwalk, Sky Vodka, Gold Peak Tea, Takori, Bebe Stores, and Campari, among others. The agency's work was actually chronicled in The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, but the Lambesis Agency closed in 2019, with Tim's father starting the marketing firm Sublime Digital in 2019. Tim Lambesis was raised Christian, and his faith was important in his household. He would attend Santa Fe Christian School, where he was voted most like Jesus, which is pretty ironic considering how the story unfolds. But then he attended the Evangelical Christian College, Liberty University in Virginia, for a brief time, where he majored in religious studies before dropping out to pursue music full-time. When speaking on his decision on putting college aside to pursue his hobby in music, Tim would explain to Chris Garza of Suicide Silence that this wasn't a hobby he could fully pursue in his 40s. He wanted to see how far he could take his hobby of writing music and playing shows, then eventually, in his own words, putting his big boy pants on and getting a real job. But as we'll discuss later, Their songwriting abilities improved, and they made a name for themselves in their scene that would lead to continued success. So Tim got his start, as many of us do, playing in various local bands in high school, but he also dabbled in producing and recording as well. Eventually, Tim would form his own band called Against the Mark with drummer Matt Carlson. The band would then change their name to Life Once Lost, but then they went into a hiatus as Tim would join Texas metalcore band Society's Finest as their guitarist, but he was only in the band for about a year. After he left that band, Tim made his way back to California, where he reformed Life Once Lost with a whole new lineup. However, he soon then realized that there was another band called A Life Once Lost, so they would change their name to As I Lay Dying. Then Tim would meet local drummer Jordan Mancino, where Tim would show him their very early demo and asked him to join. Jordan agreed and became a part of the revamped band, thus becoming the band's longtime drummer. As Tim would explain on the Garza podcast, at first Tim was writing all the songs and Jordan would just put drums over his riffs. Actually, Tim could do vocals, but he was initially an aspiring guitarist and bassist. After the band would complete their lineup, they got to work playing shows and building up a name for themselves. It was pretty quickly that the band got noticed by Pluto Records, which was a small label that had a handful of bands on it, including Norma Jean when they were first known as Ludacris, and Society's Finest, which Lambesis was a part of. After accepting their offer, the band quickly got to work on writing and recording their first record, and on June 12, 2001, As I Lay Dying released their debut album titled Beneath the Encasing of Ashes. I want to note that I personally love this gritty album cover. That's definitely a reflection of the sound on this record. Anyways, the band's early sound was far different from their melodic blend of metalcore they would eventually become known for, but there are some glimpses of that sound on certain sections of this record. During this time, metalcore as we know it today was still in its infancy, while the style of metalcore that was closely associated with hardcore was still at the forefront, so this album's sound is a lot more reminiscent of bands like Zao or Coreless. Tim actually wrote a lot of these songs in 2000 while he was only playing guitar for about a year, so that explains the heavier and a lot of times more simpler riffs on this record. They were influenced a lot by bands like Living Sacrifice and Zao, which you could clearly hear on this record. His vocals are a lot more raspy, which is different to his approach on later records. At this time, there wasn't any clean singing aside from some spoken word vocals that a lot of metalcore vocalists do, which I can't lie, I even do in my own band sometimes. But the vocals and writing on this record border on death metal, especially with certain riffs on here. But overall, this album has a lot of enjoyable moments as well as really great breakdowns and performances from all the members. I could picture some modern metalcore band covering songs off this record that would easily set off a crowd. And personally, I find myself revisiting this album a lot more after researching for this video, as there's a lot of memorable riffs on here, especially with certain breakdowns and their use of panic chords. Some examples of this are on the main riff of A Long March and the crushing breakdown on The Voices That Betray Me. So with all that being said, this is just a really solid debut album, even if the band would find their own sound on later releases. It's a lot more raw and less refined as the songs are a lot more shorter on here. I'd recommend this album to people who are really into early metalcore, where the style was a lot more raw and they fit right in with many of the bands from that era. So for a short time later, Tim and drummer Jordan Mancino would join Christian hardcore band Point of Recognition, where they would help record their final album, titled Day of Defeat. However, Tim explained on the Garza podcast, while touring with As I Lay Dying, he got a call from members of Point of Recognition, where they said, quote, "Hey, we want to be a little more full-time with touring, and we hate to put you in this situation, but you're going to have to choose," which is truthfully understandable, as I have friends who are in several bands, and there could be scheduling conflicts if more than one band wants to be full-time with touring. So given this choice, Tim Lambesis would choose to pursue As I Lay Dying full-time, and drummer Jordan Mancino would follow. Also, he would go on to explain on that same podcast that he knew that becoming a guitarist of a bigger band would help him reach the goal of being a full-time working musician, but something told him to go all in with As I Lay Dying. This tends to happen in local scenes, even today, as local musicians are oftentimes scooped up by bigger bands. Hell, even old friends of mine went on to join bands like Shadow of Intent and Angel Maker, among others. But when explaining why he made this decision, Tim Lambesis would explain, quote,
"And then I was on tour with As I Lay Dying at the time, and I got a phone call. They say, hey, we want to be a little bit more full-time touring. You're going to have to choose. Like, we hate to put you in this situation, but you got to choose." Mm-hmm. And As I Lay Dying was definitely the smaller band at the time, but it was like kind of my baby because I started it. So I said, hey, it's probably a weird decision for you guys to hear because I'm turning down the bigger band to do the smaller band, but like this is what I believe in. So Probably made the right choice.
No, you made the right choice.
After the release of Beneath the Encasing of Ashes in 2001, the band would then drop a split with American Tragedy. This was when you started to hear a shift in the band's writing style. While the band still had the rhythmic intensity of bands like Zao, Coalesce, and Living Sacrifice, they also started to add more melodic sections that were more fitting with bands of the melodic death metal scene, or the burgeoning new crop of metalcore bands coming up. When speaking on their changing approach to songwriting, Tim would tell the Garza podcast, quote,
Do you remember that band Falling Cycle?
We played their last show, man.
Okay, so
sick.
So Falling Cycle, for a brief moment, we toured with Falling Cycle, and for a brief moment, they had 2 guys that left. Mm-hmm. And so then I said, well, you guys need a guitar player? I would love to do it. And so I adapted the Falling Cycle mindset, and I said, well, I'll write a couple songs for what would be the next Falling Cycle record. And then,
serious?
Yeah, and then, so I started like riffing a little bit more melodically like them. And then they said, actually, you know what, like, we kind of like rescind our offer because we have somebody who lives like closer to us. It's just kind of like a better fit, you know, blah, blah. And it was like, hey, I mean, we literally, all we had was a couple lunches to talk about being in the band together. We never like actually, you know, put together a record. So I was like, well, I never even showed them the songs. And I said, but these songs are still cool. So I made them feel more like what I felt like was As I Lay Dying at the time. And that's literally the melodic metal influence of As I Lay Dying was sort of like derivative, because it's like Falling Cycle was influenced by In Flames. And then I was influenced by Falling Cycle, who's influenced by In Flames. And then, of course, I got into In Flames because of that. You know, and so it's like you have this, like, rhythmic Living Sacrifice side, and then this, like, melodic In Flames side. And, like, I'm trying to figure out how to put them together as a learning guitar player, you know, who's still, like, literally never taken lessons, just playing what I think sounds cool and fun to me, you know. And this many years later, it's like, you know, influencing a genre. I'm not saying that we're foundational, but we're definitely one of the earlier bands to you know, people think of metalcore and they think of there's an As I Lay Dying sound, you know.
Yes.
And so part of that is just that, like, you know, self-taught, just piecing things together that just feel right to me.
The next year, the band would begin to start writing new material for a full-length record. But during this time, the only permanent member of the band was Jordan and Tim. So while they toured, they would have friends of theirs fill in for a time being. While this was going on, the band's contract with Pluto Records would expire. After this, the relentless touring schedule would pay off as they caught the attention of legendary label Metal Blade. It was actually the more melodic sound that caught the eye of the label, and according to Tim Lambesis, the label told them how they loved the new direction they were going in. So after some discussion in March of 2003, the band officially inked a deal with Metal Blade Records. Real quick, shout out to Metal Blade for always having their finger on the pulse, being forward-thinking, and welcoming the new generation of bands in the scene with open arms. Also, notably, they signed the Black Dahlia Murder at the same time too. But this was the moment where the band and Tim Lambesis' dream was realized, where they became full-time working musicians, which is no easy feat, as it takes years of hard work to get there. But after this, the band quickly got to work on their next album, and on July 1st, 2003, the band would release their second album titled Frail Words Collapse. This album is a huge step up from their debut because as much as I love the raw sound of their first record, the sound on Frail Words Collapse is just a lot more polished, especially on the production side, as it's done by Tim and Evan White. They did not lose their edge, however, as there's some absolutely crushing breakdowns on here. As much as there's still a hardcore influence, you can see the band start to add more characteristics of melodic death metal and thrash metal, which gives the album a lot more of a varied sound. Having elements of these different subgenres on this record would have the band being closely associated with the new wave of American metal, which was really just metalcore if I'm being honest. But this next wave of metalcore bands would take over metal in a big way in the 2000s, as I Lay Dying and bands like Darkest Hour, Shadows Fall, All That Remains, and Every Time I Die, among others, would propel metalcore from a more metallic way of playing hardcore to being its own scene that was more associated with modern metal. I go a lot more in depth on this topic on my History of Moshing video if you guys are interested. Now, I haven't gone back and listened to this record in a long time, but going back to it, I'm just really impressed with how well this album aged. And truthfully, this is just top tier metalcore, like damn man. Also, certain riffs on here have a more uplifting and borderline anthemic feel that would help bring new fans in, as they seamlessly went from heavier riffs and breakdowns to clean singing and more melodic sections. The clean singing at this time was actually done by session musicians, but standout tracks on here for me include Forever, 1,000 Steps, 94 Hours, Distance is Darkness, and Falling Upon Deaf's Ears. Also, the band would drop 2 music videos in promotion for this record, for the songs 94 Hours and Forever, which got heavy rotation on Fuse and Headbangers Ball, and these channels were the mecca for heavy music back in the day, but these videos now have millions of views on YouTube. And also, the chorus of Forever has been stuck in my head for days now. This album was a watershed moment for the band. As for their major label debut, they really developed their sound, and it was a huge success as the band sold over 400,000 copies. It also helped them gain a bunch of new fans, and in support of Frail Word's collapse, the band would tour with bands like Shadows Fall, In Flames, The Black Dahlia Murder, Killswitch Engage, Hatebreed, and Sport and Enemy. Which shout out to New York hardcore, man. But As I Lay Dying were also a part of the legendary Furnace Fest in 2003 that included bands like Terror, Throwdown, Hatebreed, A Life Once Lost, Every Time I Die, The Agony Scene, Take It Back Sunday, Comeback Kid, and many, many more. Notably, Tim married his then girlfriend Megan Murphy in June of 2004, and the two would eventually adopt 2 daughters and a son who are all from Ethiopia, but we'll get into that a little more later. But real quick, before getting into the success of their follow-up, I want to briefly talk about the band's faith. So since Tim Lambesis was raised as a Christian and writes all the lyrics for As I Lay Dying, it's natural that he would write about his religious beliefs. Thus, As I Lay Dying is a Christian metal band. I do want to say that Christian metal bands span across all subgenres of metal, and these bands never make it blatant or obvious that they're Christian bands. It may be reflected in their music and writing, but you would have to really read the lyrics to pick up on the message, and the same could be said with As I Lay Dying. Metalcore bands specifically have a good amount of Christian bands that include Seven Angels, Seven Plagues, Under Oath, Silent Planet, The Devil Wears Prada, and For Today, among others. The way Tim Lambesis has described it himself, he writes about things like life and struggles, but it happens to be through a religious lens, since that's a big part of his life. But as we'll discuss later, his affinity for Christianity would fluctuate over time. So for much of 2003 and 2004, the band spent their time touring to support the success of Frail Word's collapse. But it was on these tours that the band would round out their lineup and start writing for a new record. Guitarist Evan White would leave As I Lay Dying due to his mother's death, which is completely understandable. Also, their touring guitarist at the time, Chris Lindstrom, would leave the band as well, citing that the touring lifestyle wasn't for him. Which I've talked about this in other videos, but this is completely understandable, as the touring lifestyle really isn't for everyone, as the long drives and being away from your family for long periods of time just really isn't worth it for everyone. But this is when guitarists Nick Hipa and Phil Segroso would join the band, becoming longtime members of As I Lay Dying. Having 2 full-time guitarists would undoubtedly improve the songwriting process for the band. However, it was a bit of a transition for them. Before this, Tim Lambesis was the main songwriter of the band, but when Phil joined, this would change. Tim knew how good of a guitar player he was, but then realized how talented of a songwriter he also was. This of course created some creative tension between them, as Tim was used to steering the ship of the band, and now he would have to get used to having input from Phil with songwriting and vice versa. Eventually, they both got used to this dynamic of sharing songwriting duties, but at the time, this created tension between the two of them. In his own words, Tim Lambesis would tell Garza podcast, quote,
Yeah, you guys really connected musically, like right out of the gate, it seems.
Phil and I did for sure, and I think there's some creative tension over that because at the time, I viewed myself as like, hey, I write the guitar parts mostly, and then it was like, but Phil's like, I got all these great ideas. Like, okay, well, I recognize like hands down, like some of your riffs are way better than mine. So it's like, okay, well, who's really in charge of putting together this song, And so the early days, putting our first record together, Shadows Are Security, Phil and I actually had some creative, like tension, so to speak, be like a little bit dramatic at times. And then we've like worked through that. And clearly it's like now we have this understanding of like, okay, Tim might really understand a big picture vibe of what he wants. He might have a couple riffs that have a feeling to them, but like they can all be torn apart and made more interesting from a guitar player's perspective. And so now I don't take offense if he wants to rip apart my riffs, and he's not offended if I'm like, hey, I really feel like the structure of the song needs to go this way. And there's nothing but respect now, but in those early days it created some interesting tension.
Oh yeah, like that those feelings, you're like, oh my gosh, you shut up. because your idea is always better, right? In your head.
Well, like as a young musician, if somebody says, hey, I don't like that riff, it's like you feel like, I don't like you.
I know.
And it's like, well, I wrote that riff, so you're saying you don't like me. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Oh, God, it's so hard to process when you're super young.
Yeah.
But that creative tension actually explains, because Shadows, that came out in 2005, and again, like another massive jump musically, songwriting. I mean,
When explaining how personally musicians take it when their bandmates don't like certain riffs, this is something I felt to my core. As in my experience, in order to write the best material, you need to remove the ego, and that is something that's a challenge for a lot of musicians, and it's not an easy thing to get used to. So with all that being said, on June 14, 2004, the band dropped their third studio album, titled Shadows of Security. And this album was another success for the band, as the album sold over 270,000 copies, and would peak at number 35 on the Billboard Top 200, which was their first album to do so. While this album is still solid, you could definitely hear a stylistic shift on this record, as the heavier breakdowns more reminiscent of the early wave of metalcore that shaped their first two records are less prominent, while the more catchy and melodic riffs are at the forefront, which really helped the band gain even more exposure. So this is still a really good record, it just marked a change in their sound that they would eventually develop further in later releases, which included more elements of thrash metal, death metal, and melodic death metal, but they still had the breakdowns that they were known for, just not at the forefront of their music. Also, the band would have more melodic sections and clean vocals, which was actually done by session musicians also. And I personally like the way they sing here. This album was received well by fans and critics, even helping to get more people into metal that were not typically fans of the genre. Tim does explain further on the Garza podcast that he felt that it was important to have that crossover appeal to get more people into heavy music, which had obviously paid off, and their ability to cross over was seamless. The band would release 3 music videos for this album, for the songs Through Struggle, Confined, and The Darkest Nights. Overall, this was a really good album with some memorable songs that was another big success for the band. Standout tracks for me include Meaning in Tragedy, Reflection, Repeating Yesterday, The Darkest Nights, and Through Struggle. To support this album, As I Lay Dying would tour with Shadows Fall and Parkway Drive early in the year, which is just a stacked lineup. They also toured with Madball, A Life Once Lost, and Normagene. But notably, this album marked a time where the band started to appear at more festivals, which always helps a band gain new fans. In 2005, the band would appear on Ozfest, Downloadfest, Rock AM Ring, and Cornerstone Fest. Shadows of Security did a lot for the band as they started to headline tours, appear more on festivals, and sold the most records they ever did up until that point, being their first album to chart on the top 200. Tim Lambesis himself would note that he was so ambitious and focused on building the band that he didn't take in the success that they cultivated for themselves, especially with the band being so young. He even noted that in retrospect, he didn't create the best working environment being so forward-thinking, which would continue to be a theme throughout this story. But personally, with my own bands in the past, I can relate to this, as you're so focused on building and on the next step that you might not even take a second to appreciate what you built. So the band would continue to build on this momentum. Also notably, during this time, Tim would dabble in recording and producing records for other bands in the genre, starting with Sworn Enemy's 2006 record, The Beginning of the End, which shout out to New York Hardcore, man. But he would go on to record for other notable bands in the genre, including Chelsea Grin, Impending Doom, the underrated Mazel Tov Solution, Carnifex, and Zao, among others. Tim at this point was living his dream. The band was headlining theaters and had great time slots on big festivals. He was also a full-time working musician, which is the goal for a lot of us musicians in the scene. But a few years down the line, he would be involved in a situation that would jeopardize everything he worked so hard to build. So during the 2 years of touring for Shadows of Security, the band would continue to write and really hone in on their new direction. But during the writing process in 2006, their bassist at the time, Clint Norris, would leave the band to focus more energy on his marriage. Eventually, Josh Gilbert would join the band, becoming their new bassist, and he would become a longtime member, completing what would become known as their classic lineup. But before the band would drop their next record, they came out with a compilation in 2006 that has some re-recordings of old material and included their first album, Beneath the Encasing of Ashes. The band decided to include a re-release of their first album due to the fact that it was going for high prices online at this time, and the band felt it wasn't right that fans were unable to access their older material, which was definitely the case at the time, and I respect the band for making this decision. Sometime later, the band finished writing and recording, and on August 21st, 2007, the band would release their fourth studio album, titled An Ocean Between Us, which was produced by Adam D. of Killswitch Engage, and the band would help with the recording process. Now, this album was a stylistic departure from their other releases. While the band dabbled in more melodic elements in the past, this was the album where the band would really embrace the more melodic metalcore sound, as they had a lot more choruses with clean vocals, and more of a kind of sung type of yell, if that makes sense. Kind of like the chorus of Dream Awake by Northlane. But this album would also show how they really honed in on their seamless blending of styles, especially with their heavier sections and catchy anthemic hooks, fusing their more death and thrash metal influences with more melodic choruses and passages. In the process, they would broaden their crossover appeal. On this album, their old bassists would do backing and clean vocals. The band's ability to both be catchy and heavy, especially with certain breakdowns, would prove very successful, as the band proved that they had major crossover appeal without necessarily sacrificing why fans loved them in the first place. Not an easy thing for a metal band to pull off, but they really did on this record. Songs like Nothing Left and The Sound of Truth would really display their versatile songwriting. When speaking on their songwriting approach to Sputnik Music in 2007, Tim Lambesis would say, quote, "We spent some time listening to our last record, and just being on tour, we became a little bit jaded by how the genre as a whole has sort of copied itself over and over again. We decided we wanted to be more diverse, even down to the point where we sort of felt like we should really focus on writing songs in different categories, and then pick the best songs from those categories and use them for the record." Which I can personally attest to, because although I got into heavy music a little later, there was a lot of discussion about bands being generic and sounding the same, especially in metalcore and deathcore. But standout songs include Nothing Left, An Ocean Between Us, Within Destruction, Forsaken, and The Sound of Truth. Lastly, this was a time when metalcore was extremely popular, and this would show in just how successful this record was for the band. The music videos the band dropped for this record have reached millions of views on YouTube, and the album would peak at number 8 on the Billboard Top 200, which for a metal band is really impressive. The band would be a part of festivals in 2007 like Warped Tour, Rock AM Fest, and Download UK. In these live performances, you could see a change in Tim's overall frame and size, so I think we could assess that this was around the time he got really into fitness, which as someone who loves fitness, I could get down with. However, as we'll discuss later, his relationship with fitness became unhealthy as Tim got into steroids, and this may have affected him psychologically. But back to the impact of this album, they would also be nominated in 2008 for the Best Metal Performance Grammy, but as usual, they lost to an older band, Slayer. I mean, I love Slayer, but the Grammys always fall short with metal. Anyways, the band's success would continue to grow, and they would keep touring to support this record for the next few years. So following the success of their 2007 record, An Ocean Between Us, the band would spend the next few years touring in support of this record, as it's known that a large majority of money made for an artist is on tour. But in 2009, the band would enter the studio to record the music they had been working on and in between tour cycles. This was the band's largest gap in between albums up until this point, and they really wanted to focus on not rushing the process. So on May 7, 2010, the band would release their 5th studio album, titled The Powerless Rise, which was met with widespread acclaim, with Exclaim even calling it their most accomplished record yet, which I can't help but agree with. Notably, Tim Lambesis would note on Chris Garza's podcast that this was when the band and metalcore at the time began to plateau a bit, not musically, but in the sense that they hit the ceiling for how big they could get within the genre. He noted that this was around the time that some bands began to change their sound a bit to reach for a wider appeal, while As I Lay Dying weren't really interested in that. They still wanted to be successful while keeping the core elements that made the band themselves, which makes a lot of sense as they were very successful without having to compromise their sound, while having a very versatile songwriting style. Speaking of that, The Powerless Rise is, in many ways, a continuation on the more melodic metalcore style they embraced on An Ocean Between Us, but I noticed that while still having core elements of metalcore, this album would have songwriting elements of thrash and death metal that were a lot more prominent. I also want to note that As I Lay Dying's ability to distill these multiple styles in a very cohesive way definitely helped the band achieve continued success. I also want to note that this was the album where Josh Gilbert started to write the clean vocal parts, and it's a step up from prior records in my eyes. Standout tracks include Beyond Our Suffering, Anadon Sea, Parallels, and Upside Down Kingdom. While overall interest in heavier music, specifically metalcore, started to decline a bit in the 2010s, and Google Trends support this, The Powerless Rise was still a big success for the band, as the album charted on multiple album charts across different countries, and peaked at number 10 on the Billboard Top 200. In support of this record, the band would tour with Suicide Silence, Heaven Shall Burn, and Silosis in 2010. They also toured with Wings of Plague and After the Burial in 2011, which I actually did a video detailing the life, career, and tragic mental decline of Justin Lowe of After the Burial if you guys are interested. But the band would stay consistent throughout the early part of the 2010s until events in Tim's personal life would put the band on hold for a number of years. So being in a successful metal band and being a working musician is obviously a blessing, but things could get very cyclical and monotonous. So as we discussed before, the band would tour to support their record, The Powerless Rise, and whenever they had time off, they would write for a future full-length. Notably, the recording process of this album would see a shift in their dynamic, as Tim would record his vocals in his own studio in California, while the rest of the band would record in Colorado. Also, as Tim Lambesis would note on his appearance on the Garza podcast, instead of writing being a collaborative effort in a rehearsal space, the band would email ideas to each other as they began to somewhat drift apart around this time. The album still came together and ended up being well received, but this marked a change in the band that I will get into a little later. So with all this being said, Awakened by As I Lay Dying dropped on September 25th, 2012, and was another success for the band. Also, as we talked about earlier, the band hit a ceiling as far as crossover appeal. So stylistically, the album was very consistent with the band's earlier work from 2007 and 2010, that being a cohesive blend of metalcore with elements of death and thrash metal. I like to note that there was definitely more thrash-oriented riffs with some characteristics of groove metal even being on here too. Overall, just a very consistent album that proved why the band appealed to so many different crowds across the metal scene. The solos are some of my personal favorite parts of this record, as there are more moments where the guitarists go all out and shred on here, which wasn't really as common, as After the Burial is the only other metalcore leading band I've came across that shreds like this. Standout tracks for me include Cauterize, A Greater Foundation, Wasted Words, Defender, and My Only Home. But truthfully, once learning about the shifting band dynamic on this record, you could hear the difference because this album is still high quality. It's just very similar to their work on prior albums. When further explaining what caused this shift on the Garza podcast, Tim would explain that bands typically have a leading force who helps steer the ship, and that was Tim's role in the band for the majority of their career. So once Tim started to focus more on his personal life, like fitness and starting to date again, after the dissolution of his marriage, he withdrew from that role, and no one else really filled that in the band. This is actually the dynamic that most bands that I personally come across have. Hell, even in my own band, one of us is the driving force who helps guide us along the way. Shout out to you if you're watching this. If you know, you know. But also, Tim Lambesis and Chris Garza would give some more insight into this change that As I Lay Dying and other bands go through during this time in their careers, explaining how once a full-time band hits their 4th or 5th record, the process definitely becomes monotonous and you're basically just pushing through the next album cycle. So this time around, Tim, while focusing more on his personal life, felt that they could coast since their band was more than established at this point and selling out theaters across the United States and abroad, which makes a lot of sense as they had tour managers, bookers, and other employees on staff to help at any given time. But lastly, this album was recorded and came out around the time that Tim Lambesis got his degree in religious studies, which had a deep impact on the writing of Awakened. Tim Lambesis will go on to explain to Chris Garza that he went into studying religion as a way to defend his faith, but the more he learned, the more he was unable to defend certain beliefs in Christianity. So if it's not too obvious by now, I could be kind of nerdy in certain aspects. So I have an interest in stuff like spirituality, history, theology, and philosophy. So in my own experience, I could see how the more you learn and dive deep into other religions, the harder it could be to figure out your own religious identity. It could be hard to grapple with and transition into a completely different worldview, especially when you were raised religious and your studies shatters your previous worldview. Tim would detail this experience in depth on the Garza podcast, explaining, quote,
And, I had spent all my 20s very, very involved in, like, Christian theology. I was actually like a theology student. Philosophy and religious studies was a bachelor's degree I got. And so the previous year before Awakened, I had finished my degree in religious studies, and during that process of trying to like defend that point of view, which was the primary reason that I like dug so deeply into it, I realized like I can't in good conscience defend some of these beliefs because you know, I know too much now. You know what I mean? And it was like this kind of okay, well, this reshapes what it is that I believe. And I think looking back, there's that shock of my whole moral system being built on because God told me so, and then not, oh, if that's not the case, then like what do I build my life on now? And I feel like that's actually a dangerous thing about somebody who grows up entirely like too religious, so to speak, is that their whole framework is based off of because God told me so. But there are actually great other reasons to you know, to have morality. And so
also, when writing the lyrics for this album, Tim wanted to convey his changing beliefs and perspective in a way that was still poetic, but at the same time, fans could pick up on these themes, which were all over this record. For example, the song A Greater Foundation seems to reflect this, as the lyrics include lines like, sincere, I sought your own truth and divine purpose through midst of revelation. Guidance all wrapped in a paper box, supported only so long, as my mind was the enemy, I could not in conscience hold on. Other lines in this song further explore this change in Tim's belief, which includes when he wrote, quote, the powerful constant that I once leaned on is no longer there. You call this shameful disbelief a process like losing my closest friend, which in my eyes clearly conveys how his studies led him to conclusions that he couldn't defend certain aspects of Christianity. Lastly, these lyrics on Whispering Silence I found prophetic, and Tim was vaguely reflecting on his change of character, maybe after losing his faith and the worldview he once built his entire life around, as he wrote, quote, each little piece begins to stack up. Now suffering under the weight of my choices, I hardly recognize myself. Somewhere along the lines, there stopped being lines at all. But this album marked another success for the band, even if they felt that they hit a ceiling, as the album charted in multiple countries and peaked at number 11 on the Billboard Top 200. The many changes in Tim Lambesis' personal life, as well as his character, would see him make choices that would lead to him making a decision that would shock the metal world and the wider public, as he got caught almost making an irreversible action in getting his wife killed that would impact the lives of his children, family, bandmates, and himself. So after the continued success of As I Lay Dying and the most recent record, Awaken, the band would tour to support this album. But shortly after Tim came back home from playing a brief tour in Asia, news would break that would stun the metal community and the wider public in general. On May 7, 2013, frontman of Christian metal band Tim Lambesis was arrested for attempting to hire a hitman to kill his wife outside of an Oceanside, California Barnes & Noble bookstore, according to California Local 3 News. Now this goes without saying, but this was a huge deal when the news broke, and as someone who saw this unfold in real time when I was around 14 years old, this left all of us within the metal community speechless. He was the frontman of arguably the biggest Christian metal band at the time, and he was charged with the solicitation of murder, seemingly the last person you would think was capable of something like this. At the time, there was no details of the case that were available to the public, so journalists and fans were left to speculate on what really happened in this situation. The remaining members of As I Lay Dying would give Billboard a brief statement on this situation, simply saying, quote, as we post this, the legal process is taking its course, and we have no more information than you do. There are many unanswered questions, and the situation will become clearer in the coming days and weeks. We'll keep you informed as best as we can. The band's 4 other members also said in that statement, quote, our thoughts right now are with Tim, his family, and with everyone affected by this terrible situation, and with our fans, whom we love and draw strength from. Thank you for understanding and, as always, for your support of As I Lay Dying, which was simple enough as the remaining members of the band only knew what was available to the public, which was very little at this time. 2 days later, Tim Lambesis would plead not guilty to charges of solicitation of murder, which is insane as they literally have recordings of him trying to hire a hitman, but we'll get into that a little later. But at that time, his lawyer's defense was that Tim Lambesis was on steroids, stating, quote, his thought processes were devastatingly affected by his steroid use, which may be a valid argument, as abuse of steroids are known to have physical as well as psychological effects on the person taking it. In his own testimony, a man named Nico would describe how steroids affected him and would explain, quote,
I was getting really aggressive and really not violent, but having a lot of violent thoughts. And I'm a really calm person. And I dislike violence. I do not like violence, but I was having these dreams of killing people and getting killed, and all of a sudden I'm watching a lot of like street fighting on YouTube and all of these things. It's really strange how taking that stuff will not only change you physically, but mentally. And it's crazy.
I just wanted to show you guys that so you can see how steroids can really affect a person mentally. But going back to the timeline, that same day his bail was set at a whopping $3 million as he was deemed a flight and safety risk. But eventually his bail was changed from $3 to $2 million. Then on May 30th, 2013, Tim Lambesis was released on bail where he was on house arrest, wearing a GPS monitor. He was also subjected to strict travel restrictions, and he wasn't able to communicate with his estranged wife and 3 kids. This led to, of course, their planned tour with Killswitch Engage being cancelled. But what were the circumstances that led to Tim's arrest and him making this life-changing decision to attempt to off his wife, and how did he get caught for trying to do this? Well, at the time, this information was not yet available to the public, but we would learn as hearings and motions began what these circumstances were. So throughout the early part of 2014 was when the state of California would hold various pretrial hearings on the case of Tim Lambesis, and this was where the details of the case would become public knowledge. So in August of 2012, around the time Awaken would drop, Tim would allegedly send his then wife, Megan Murphy Lambesis, an email while on tour. In this email, he would state that he no longer loved her, had engaged in extramarital affairs, and quote, no longer believed in God. Which I try to keep these videos as objective as possible, but that's just cold, man. Anyways, soon after this, they separated, and the next month was when Megan would officially file for divorce. According to New York Daily News, in the divorce papers, she cited multiple reasons for the separation, including a change in Tim, his faith, and behavior. Also, he became more preoccupied with tattoos, apparently spending thousands of dollars on them, and bodybuilding instead of his family and marriage. Lastly, she cited an incident where Tim, quote, had started acting dangerously distracted around his children. So a few months would go by where the couple were separated, but not legally divorced yet. This next part, which is basically a full timeline of events of how Tim tried to hire a hitman, was archived by Loudwire, so shout out to y'all for that. Anyways, while in the process of this divorce in February of 2013, a man named Brett started working at a gym called Pure Fitness, located in the seaside town of Carlsbad, California. This just so happened to be the same gym that Tim Lambesis trained at for some time. Brett has been described as a trainer, but notably, attorneys would imply that he supplied steroids and possibly other drugs, but Brett would deny these claims. By the next month, the two would become cool, often engaging in small talk at the gym. In April 2013, Brett began to hear about Tim's troubled marriage, and this was when Tim texted him to see if they could talk. The two men then met in the gym's parking lot. This took place on April 22nd, 2013. By this time, Tim was living with his new girlfriend, Amanda, and she was actually there but went to the gym to work out while Tim and Brett would talk. Tim started off the conversation by asking him if he knew why he was there, and Brett would jokingly respond to him by saying he was hoping it wasn't to kill anybody. Then Tim strangely responds by saying, "That's funny because that's exactly why I'm here." I don't know. If Tim thought this man had those type of connections, then there's a possibility that he really did sell steroids. So after this, Tim would explain to Brett his situation with Megan and how their relationship had deteriorated, but they were still legally married. Apparently, in Tim's own words, he explained to Brett how, quote, he wanted to make sure that the kids had one healthy relationship instead of two bad ones, while also complaining how she was spending all their money on divorce attorneys. Brett understood then and there what Tim wanted. He wanted someone to kill his wife, but Brett would tell Tim that that's not my thing. I'm not involved in any behavior like that, explaining that he's a bodyguard, not an assassin. But Tim wanted to know if Brett knew anyone who could do this for him, and according to Brett, Tim said, "I know you know people." So after this meeting, Brett became understandably nervous about all of this, telling investigators that, "I thought he was going to go through with it, with or without me." So then he sought the advice of an attorney, where he was told that he needed to get a tape recording of that, otherwise he would be an accessory to murder if it happened. This was when the authorities became aware that Tim Lambesis was attempting to look for someone to kill his wife, and according to the San Diego Reader, on May 2nd, 2013, a sting operation was established. After this, about 2 days later, Brett would initiate another meeting, and Tim's then girlfriend Amanda would also show up. They met up at a local Barnes & Noble where Tim would allegedly tell Amanda that the two would talk about motorcycles and music, so she would then leave the two alone. During this meeting, apparently Brett claimed that he offered alternatives on handling the situation, saying, quote, "Go to a counselor, talk to somebody, get help," but Lambesis wouldn't be dissuaded. Tim would then go on to complain about his estranged wife and how she kept him on the road so that he would generate more money when he didn't want to travel as much and produce for more bands. Once Brett saw that Tim wouldn't be dissuaded in any way, he told him that he knows someone who could do it, and Brett referred to a man named Red, who was an undercover cop posing as a hitman. Tim was allegedly all for it. Later, Brett would call Tim and ask if it was okay for him to give Red Tim's phone number, and Tim then agreed. Then on May of 2013, when Tim had just returned from his short tour in Asia, Red reached out to him to set up a meeting. The first time was rejected, as Tim had picked up his kids, but then the pair agreed to meet up at 2 p.m. The two would then meet at that same Barnes & Noble store. Red asked Tim to bring $1,000, a picture of his wife, and her address. The $1,000 would be a down payment, as the whole thing would cost about $20,000, which Tim agreed to immediately after Red suggested that as the price. The two were discussing this in the music section of the store, where Tim said he wanted his wife gone, but didn't care what way it was done, telling Red that's up to him. Tim had 3 dates in mind for this to go down, and notably these would be days that he had the kids, so that he would have a secure alibi. The undercover officer kept trying to get Tim to admit that he wanted his wife dead, but Tim kept on using vague language like he wanted her gone, or never wanted her to come back. Tim at this point began to walk away, but then he turned around and said, "Just to clarify, just so you know, I do want her dead." Then it was go time, as Tim was arrested at that same Barnes & Noble without incident. About a week after that Loudwire article came out that showed in explicit detail how Tim Lambesis actively sought someone to take out his wife and wouldn't back down until then getting caught by an undercover officer, Tim would change his plea from not guilty to guilty. I really still can't believe that he tried to plead not guilty for this, as he was literally caught on audio trying to make this happen. But with Tim pleading guilty, he would spend the next few months on house arrest, awaiting sentencing. And on May 16, 2014, Tim Lambesis was sentenced to 6 years in prison, with 48 days credited while he was awaiting trial. Although there's no footage or transcript available, after his sentencing, Tim would give a deeply heartfelt courtroom apology to his bandmates, family, his wife, and his fans as well. His bandmates would talk about the impact of this initial apology years later. However, inflammatory statements Tim Lambesis would make to alternative press about how the majority of As I Lay Dying stopped being Christian and only continued to associate themselves with the religion to sell records would sour his relationship with his bandmates for a number of years. Years later, in their discussion video, Tim would express how these statements were made months before his sentencing, and he made them only out of, quote, self-preservation, but we'll discuss this in depth a little later. Lastly, the rest of Tim's bandmates would leave the band after this case came to light, and drummer Jordan Mancino would be the only remaining member, as he had part ownership in As I Lay Dying. This case and Tim's subsequent incarceration would lead to the band going on hiatus. The remaining members of As I Lay Dying would go on to form the band Woven War with Old Sleeper vocalist Shane Blay. They claim that this project was created before this news came to light, but I personally find this kind of hard to believe, as when As I Lay Dying managed to come back, Woven War went on hiatus. But Woven War would achieve success as they toured frequently, dropping 2 studio albums that were well received, but personally, I've never been a big fan of this band, but they made some very catchy metalcore that leaned towards traditional heavy metal. Also notably, in 2016, while serving out his 6-year sentence, Tim Lambesis would file a lawsuit against 2 separate detention facilities for over $35 million. He claimed that these 2 prisons denied him anastrozole, a drug that's used to counteract the side effects of withdrawal from steroids, but this case was later denied. But eventually, Tim Lambesis would be released from prison, where the repercussions of his actions would become apparent. So after serving 2.5 years, Tim Lambesis was quietly released from prison on December 17th, 2016, but reports of his release would not come until a few months later. For about a year after his release, Tim or the band didn't make any statement, and it seems like Tim may have been getting his personal life in order behind the scenes after this life-changing decision that almost cost Megan her life. During this time, while Tim Lambesis was keeping a low profile, there were rumors circulating that Tim would bring back As I Lay Dying with all new members, but none of this was exactly confirmed at the time. But about a year after his release from prison, on December 17, 2017, Tim Lambesis released a statement on the official As I Lay Dying Facebook page. In this lengthy statement, Tim would start by apologizing to his wife and children for his, quote, appalling actions, going on to say, quote, there's not a single day that goes by where I don't wish I could undo the damage I caused. And out of respect for their wishes, I will not discuss anything about them now or in the future. He went on to apologize to his family for the trauma he caused them and the fact that they have to continue to live with this. Tim would apologize to everyone who was affected by his actions, which included bandmates, road crew, managers, attorneys, agents, and label people. Tim also expressed regret on how he dealt with the aftermath of his arrest with, quote, bitterness that I should have directed towards myself. He also sent apologies to his fans and people who may have looked up to him. Importantly, he stated that music has and always will be a part of me and has helped me get through the darkest parts of my journey. However, this apology is not a part of promoting anything. He ended off his statement by saying, quote, I will continue to apologize in both words and actions moving forward, which I do find personally commendable, as he knew his actions could have possibly been irreversible to his family and his wife, and no amount of apologies could change that. But true change is about consistency, so he knew he had to prove that through his actions. But with all this being said, this apology received mixed reception from fans in the metal community as people were divided. While some still showed disdain for him and his actions, especially how irreversible it could have been, others still condemned his actions while showing forgiveness towards him and his seemingly genuine effort at change. Topics like redemption and true change are very polarizing for people, especially with the rise of cancel culture. So with Tim's actions and long apology, fans were split on how they felt. This split could be seen a year later when the band started to gear up for a comeback. So after Tim's public apology to his loved ones, fans, and bandmates, things were still very much up in the air with what the future held for As I Lay Dying. There was clearly a demand for new music, even in spite of the polarizing reactions from fans and critics on Tim's prior actions, which still did call into question if it was possible for him to really change. Even rumors were sparked that Tim was gearing up to bring up the band with a whole new lineup. However, as we'll discuss in a little bit, behind the scenes, long conversations were had between the bandmates where their friendships with Tim were reconciled. This at the time was not public knowledge, so when As I Lay Dying dropped the song and video for the song My Own Grave, it came as a surprise. Some fans were more than excited, while others were apprehensive, even debating on Reddit if this choice was made out of genuine forgiveness or for the money. And those questions I find warranted because a band at that level is basically a full-time job and more than profitable. Anyways, the song was a huge success as the video has over 28 million views and became one of the band's most streamed songs. Lyrically, this song is very on the nose and it's clear that Tim is expressing his feelings on his regression in his personal life and how he was essentially digging his own grave with his choices. The chorus simply says, buried alive inside of my own grave and there's no one else to blame. It is clear through these lyrics that Tim had deep regret over his actions and how it affected not only him, but everyone around him. The song overall is incredible as the chorus is just soaring, and the machine gun breakdowns is one of my favorites on the record, as it gave me the ill stank face when I first heard it. Also, the solo was great too. Overall, they came back on such a strong note, with clearly something to prove. In the description of the music video, the band gave a brief statement to fans, simply saying, quote, we are tremendously grateful to have found positive resolve from the worst moments of our history. The previous chapter of our journey was one of pervasive hurt and pain. Subsequent years found us on varied paths, all of which slowly led towards resolution of growth, healing, and reconciliation. As I Lay Dying's collective purpose is to share a message of hope for everyone through the empowering outlet of music, and we are humbled by the overwhelming support we have received from family, friends, and fans so far. But soon after this, As I Lay Dying announced that they would have a comeback show at Soma Side Stage in San Diego, California. Once this show was announced, it sold out in only 4 minutes, which made it even more clear that fans wanted this comeback. The show was a success for the band, and actually on the same day of this show, they dropped a video on their YouTube channel titled Discussion. This video was a conversation between all the members of As I Lay Dying, where they discussed how they got to the point where a comeback with their classic lineup was even possible. The vibe of this video is serious, and things got tense at times, as everyone in the band speaks very transparently on how Tim's actions affected them in their personal and professional lives, while Tim listens on in an open way while taking personal accountability. So in this discussion video, Tim starts off by expressing the differences between his public apology and the ones he gave to his bandmates. He would then go on to describe why he reached out to Josh and Jordan first, as it felt more natural to him. The way Josh would describe it, he was stunned that Tim reached out to him, not even knowing how to reply. Josh then reached out to Jordan and he revealed that he also got the text. Josh then waited a number of days to reply. He decided that he needed time to have that talk with Tim. Then in February of 2017, they talked on the phone. Josh felt that his apology was sincere, as it also included the way Tim acted after his arrest, with his comments to different publications. His words and apology meant a lot to Josh, and Josh expressed how this was the start of him seeing a positive change in Tim. Tim would then explain how, when he got released, a Woven War tour just ended, and he didn't want to, quote, drop a bomb on them. Then Jordan would express his feelings, explaining how heavy this was for him, and especially with how busy he was with touring as he filled in with Unearthed. He expressed how the rest of the band basically started over and rebuilt their lives. Jordan explained that As I Lay Dying getting back together never really crossed his mind until Tim reached out to him. He thought to himself, what's going to happen next? What's Tim going to do this time to complicate their lives again? But he did appreciate the apology and the gesture. Jordan did feel a lot of uncertainty, as they all had baggage due to the situation that had to be dealt with. After Jordan spoke, Phil would then explain how the murder for hire situation wasn't the start of their relationship ending. It started years before that, but he did say that in spite of the terrible circumstances, he did feel some sort of relief because he didn't have to be so angry and even participate in As I Lay Dying anymore. Phil still set out to do music in any way he could, and he would explain how Tim's incarceration was a peaceful time for him, as they didn't have to deal with any manipulation from Tim. Notably, Phil and Nick were the most bitter and upset at the overall situation, which is understandable. Phil was definitely the most direct with Tim and wanted nothing to do with him or As I Lay Dying, especially when comments Tim made in the press came out about how the band stopped being Christian and only continued to do so to sell records. That fueled the anger he felt, but later down the line when Tim reached out, he wanted nothing to do with him. Tim explained that he didn't want to insert himself in his life, but he wanted to at least express his regret and apologize if it meant that he could heal. Several of Tim's actions showed Phil that maybe Tim was a better person, because those actions didn't reflect the old Tim, especially his public apology. He was very resentful at how things were, but at least wanted to hear him out. Phil immediately noticed a difference in Tim, how he was more attentive, and on a human level he was different. This would lead to Phil and Nick eventually patching things up as well. Nick would then describe his feelings towards Tim as more intense than anyone else in the band, and describes Woven War as an outlet for their feelings. Nick would start off by saying that he didn't know how to deal with it and that they weren't victims, but they were the closest ones to the situation. He talked about how Tim's courtroom apology was a moment for them where they considered that Tim might have changed and understood how his actions affected all of them. But then when Tim put out a statement where he dodged accountability, that made Nick lose empathy for him. Nick was very proud of Woven War and their record, but he felt that he couldn't escape Tim and what happened, because the press would just ask him about Tim. Nick felt that this was destroying him, especially the sensationalism surrounding the situation and the fact that he couldn't let go of the hatred. He explained how he came to this realization when he did an interview with Woven War. During this interview, the last question was about Tim's then lawsuit against multiple correctional facilities. He tried to answer it as vaguely as possible, but when the interview came out, that was the main headline. He was still upset about this to the point that he told Tim when he reached out to him, "No, I know you can't change." But eventually, Nick and Phil met and reconciled their relationship, and this would lead to Nick giving Tim a chance. Since he respectfully apologized to him and made a public apology without immediately promoting something, this made Nick question his assessment that Tim could never change, and they reconciled their friendship. Overall, the 30-minute video provided fans with deep insight as to how As I Lay Dying managed to get back together, and how Tim was able to show through his actions that he was seemingly a changed person. So with the release of their first single, My Own Grave, and having a successful comeback show, it was also announced that Shaped by Fire would be released on September 20th, 2019 via Nuclear Blast Records. It's clear that the band has something to prove on this album, as all the performances are done at a very high level, and truthfully, this is my favorite production of any of their records, as the tone just sounds full and beefy, while in my eyes, not falling for the trap of being overproduced, as some bands in modern metal fall for that. Anyways, this album is definitely in the realm of their signature style of metalcore, mixed with elements of thrash and death metal, but it's hard to describe. They just sound so on point on here. They seamlessly go from more melodic choruses with the soaring and at time anthemic feel to these very tight solos. The breakdowns to me are a huge highlight as they play them with such tight precision, especially the drumming from Jordan, as some of these rhythms are very complicated. Just exceptional performances throughout this record. If you can't tell already, I love machine gun style breakdowns. In my eyes, this is one of their most consistent albums, as there's no filler, and it's clear they have something to prove on here. The lyrics are obviously a reflection of his actions in 2013, and the aftermath that he caused all those years ago. At the time, it did seem that he was truly regretful, and fans were very excited to hear new music from As I Lay Dying, with many being quick to forgive him, especially with how genuine his apology felt. But my standout tracks on here include Blinded, Undertow, Torn Between, Redefined, and Only After We've Fallen. The band would tour Europe and the US to support this record, and things seemed to be going well for Tim in his career. His band successfully came back in spite of his terrible actions years prior, and he was able to salvage his friendships with his bandmates. But slowly, cracks would begin to show, as members from this classic As I Lay Dying lineup would start to leave the band, and they were swiftly replaced. It seemed like Tim had the situation under control and was doing well with this new lineup, but as the band was gearing up to drop another record, all of his bandmates would leave, and videos were leaked that would put into question the authenticity of his claims that he changed. With As I Lay Dying being able to pull off what seemed like the impossible, with them successfully bringing back the band, as well as Tim Lambesis salvaging the friendships between him and his bandmates, things continued to look up for them. But as time went by, cracks began to show. Following the success of their album Shaped by Fire in 2019, the band was able to support the record by touring Europe with Chelsea Grin, Unearthed, and Fit for a King. And towards the end of 2019, they would tour North America with Emmure and After the Burial. But in early 2020, the band would play a few shows in Asia before the COVID pandemic hit, forcing all of us into lockdown for the better part of a year. After lockdown was complete, the band would not tour nearly as much as they used to, but they were still active. But slowly, members of their classic lineup would begin to leave, and this would call into question the character of Tim Lambesis that seemed to be redeemed by this point. In August of 2020, it was reported that longtime guitarist Nick Hepa had possibly left the band, as he removed any association with the band from his social media, and he was not seen in any performances with them. Over a year later, in August of 2021, Nick finally confirmed his departure from the band. In his statement, he would say, quote, "This is not an indictment on any who choose to remain or be involved. There is tremendous good that can be accomplished through singular focus on the power of music. However, to my memory and recent experience, it comes at the cost of tolerating behavior which at times mistreats, disrespects, and hurts other people." He will go on to say that, at this point though, it has been well over a year since I have distanced myself from them on a personal and professional level. The talent and unshakable ambition of the band is undeniable. They will continue to release successful music and do great business. On a human level, I hope everything fares well for them. This statement, while not throwing anyone under the bus, seems to imply some mistreatment and not a very healthy work environment, which many surmised was about Tim, as he has been the band's longtime leader. As we would find out later, Tim was starting to regress, and the severity of what Nick implied probably should have been taken more seriously. This would not hinder the band, as they would move forward with just Phil on guitar temporarily. The band would drop the single for the song Roots Below the next month, and then took some time to write and tour during 2022 and 2023. In May of 2022, however, longtime bassist and vocalist Josh Gilbert would also leave the band, but he would keep the statement brief, thanking the band for the time he spent with them and not giving too much of an explanation for his departure. As I Lay Dying would also take this time to announce new developments for the band, as Ryan Neff of Miss May I would replace Josh as their full-time bassist and vocalist, while Ken Sussy of Unearthed would take over as their second guitarist. But surprisingly, longtime drummer of the band, Jordan Mancino, would also leave the band in 2022. This was a surprise, as he was a founding member of the band and had part ownership. He cited his reason for leaving as, quote, a number of ongoing internal issues that have not yet been resolved, which left a lot of fans curious as to what was happening behind the scenes. But listen, a lot of bands have their internal issues that they eventually work through, and metal is notoriously a genre where frequent lineup changes are common. But considering Tim's actions in 2013, that called into question his moral character. These new developments were strange, making many think to themselves, has he devolved back into that old person? After most of the classic lineup left the band except for Phil and Tim, the band began to gear up to drop their 8th record, prophetically titled Through Storms Ahead. They began the rollout in May of 2024 with the release of their song and video for Burden, and dropped a song every other month to build up hype for their new record. One of my favorites being the song We Are the Dead featuring Slaughter to Prevail and Chelsea Grin. And real quick, shout out to Tom Barber of Chelsea Grin, because back when he was in Lorna Shore, we used to play a lot of shows together, and he was a big supporter of my first band, so shout out to you, man. Anyways, it was announced that this new record would drop on November 15th, 2024, but before this album would even come out, things would start to unravel for Tim Lambesis and As I Lay Dying's future. It first started when Ryan Neff, also of Miss May I, would leave the band on October 18th, 2024, writing a short statement saying, "This choice comes after much reflection, and I believe it is the right step for my personal and professional journey. I am grateful for the experiences and connections I made during my time with the band. Thank you to all the fans for your support." Which may seem fine, but leaving a band right before the first album you recorded with them is set to drop is strange in many ways. But shortly after, about 6 days later, both guitarist Ken Sussey and new drummer Nick Pierce would also leave As I Lay Dying, stating that their personal morals have been tested to a breaking point and needing to preserve, quote, personal health and integrity, which sparked much debate online with fans as they discussed what could possibly be going on behind the scenes. Did Tim fully regress into the same person who almost had his wife killed? Was the dynamic of the band that toxic and unhealthy? At the time, there were more questions than answers, but to make things even worse, just a week later, longtime guitarist of the band and last remaining member of the classic lineup of As I Lay Dying, Phil Segroso, would also announce his departure from the band. He would first let fans know that he was preparing a detailed statement for them, which shout out to Rock News for the archive. But in his official statement, he started off by saying, quote, "With recent events including the departure of band members and the cancellation of our European tour ahead of our new album release, it is clear we're in a difficult and serious situation." He would then go on to say, quote, "Simply put, recent actions have shown that As I Lay Dying no longer offers a healthy or safe environment for anyone involved, whether creatively, personally, or professionally. After witnessing some concerning patterns of behavior, I've realized that I can no longer in good conscience enable further actions that could negatively affect anyone working within this space. For these reasons, I feel it is in my best interest to completely distance myself both creatively and personally from As I Lay Dying." One section of his statement reads, "With 21 years that I have dedicated to this band, it does not sit well with me to leave or abandon what I've considered to be my life's work. I don't feel that I or others should be forced out like so many have in the past." He ends off this statement by saying, quote, "Over time, As I Lay Dying has been held back by dysfunction, and I feel it's no longer my responsibility to bear that burden." All of the other statements that former bandmates of As I Lay Dying made alluded to some sort of ongoing issue going on behind the scenes that was clearly about Tim given his history of behavior, but Phil's statement gave a higher level of transparency that clearly showed that Tim had a pattern of behavior that was obviously toxic, especially since before the news broke in 2013, his relationship with his bandmates were on the brink back then. But it seems that Tim's unhealthy pattern of behavior extended to his band and career, not just his personal life, as it seems that he created an unideal environment for his bandmates to say the very least, to the point that Phil felt that he had no choice but to leave his life's work, and hopefully he's able to rebuild in the future. And there's always the possibility of his former bandmates bringing back Woven War, as they were highly successful in their own right, to the point that when Tim first was released from prison, many members didn't initially care for As I Lay Dying's return. But in spite of the band clearly being very successful, still in high demand, and in the process of rolling out their new album, the rest of As I Lay Dying wanted nothing to do with Tim anymore. But this also called into question what the hell was going on behind the scenes. The public didn't have to wait very long to get an answer, but we'll get into that shortly. Also notably, when Phil left the band, someone pointed out on Reddit how, quote, for Tim to go through this whole supposed redemption of self over these last few years, and then try to convince the world he's changed when obviously he's still the issue, is a spit in the face to everyone that tried to give him a second chance. He's ruined now. Also, rumors did circulate about Tim possibly being abusive to his wife around this time, in October of 2024, but nothing was confirmed and things were very much still up in the air. After what many have described as a mass exodus, Tim Lambesis finally addressed the situation while not going into much specific detail, but explaining, quote, I needed some time to process all that has happened recently with As I Lay Dying. As I reflect, I certainly agree that there was an unhealthy environment that made leaving for a new tour with the previous lineup unrealistic. It had become difficult to figure out even the smallest details, and I admit I could stick strong to my vision for the future of As I Lay Dying when others think it should go another direction. He also only addressed Phil leaving specifically and said that he and Phil began to not see eye to eye financially, personally, and creatively. Lastly, he reassured fans that As I Lay Dying would continue as he will rebuild a new team with an environment that is, quote, positive and supportive, which is like, come on, man. But in spite of these events, the band still dropped the album Through Storms Ahead, which was a really solid follow-up to their comeback record, and I loved a lot of the clean sung choruses, but the reception of the album was overshadowed by the band seemingly falling apart. But when it rains, it pours, and things would go from bad to worse for Tim Lambesis. About a week and a half after the release of Through Storms Ahead, 2 videos leaked that showed a clearly abusive dynamic in Tim's relationship with his current wife, Dany Ciara, who he married back in 2022. Now, I will not show these videos here, but I will link them in the description for those who are interested. I decided not to show these videos because I just got monetized not too long ago, and I don't want to piss off the YouTube police as soon as I get monetized, but I will describe what is seen in these videos right now. So in the first video, the couple are in their bedroom where they're clearly in an argument, and Tim then gets into Dany's face, yelling at her, then walks away. After he walks away, he then starts screaming, but he is clearly in distress. He then grabs her face and starts yelling at her, and proceeds to hit himself in the head and punching his chest. In this first leaked video, there is no audio, but you could clearly see that he is yelling. But to many, this first video sealed the fate of their view on Tim and how he never changed. This video in the eyes of the public proves that he is abusive. Plus, the case from 2013 doesn't help either. The second video is much shorter, but there is audio this time. This video shows Tim flipping over a table and hitting himself repeatedly while his wife tells him to stop. Both videos show a clear toxic and abusive dynamic in their relationship, and Tim displays some very unhinged behavior that many consider abusive. People on Reddit all reacted by being shocked but not surprised after everything that unfolded prior. People pointed out how this is unhealthy behavior and healthy people don't act this way. Someone else pointed out the obvious by saying, quote, it's like he's trying hard not to strangle his own wife. If they weren't done when the new lineup fell apart, the band definitely is now. He's done. Psychopathic, abusive, man-child, I swear to God. Soon after this, the metal world erupted once again, as basically the person who tried to have his wife killed was outed as an abuser. And in this day and age, those type of allegations, especially with proof, are not tolerated in the slightest. Also, YouTubers started to report on his downfall and the end of As I Lay Dying, with some making hit pieces on the situation, which call it what you will, but your whole band leaving before your album drops, with many of them citing an unhealthy environment, then this comes out. It's not a good look, especially when you spent years on a redemption arc. That's not to say that true change and redemption is not possible, but seeing that footage was disturbing, and people instantly wrote him off as the same person who tried to have his wife killed years prior. But in a shocking turn of events, when addressing the videos, Tim would say that it was actually his wife who was abusive towards him, both physically and emotionally. He also stated that he initiated a domestic investigation towards her, and that he was getting a restraining order towards her too. Now, I do want to say that men experiencing domestic abuse is a real thing, and I've personally had friends who have dealt with this type of thing in the past. It is a very serious thing while often being demonized and made fun of by certain people. Now, while Tim does display unhinged behavior, those two videos did not show any physical assault being done by either parties, aside from Tim grabbing his wife and screaming in her face, which is intimidation. As of right now, there hasn't been any updates on this situation, but we will see in due time how all this unfolds in the future, and if it is even possible for Tim to recover from this. So, that would have been the end of the video, but there's been some new developments while I was editing on the situation with Tim Lambesis and his estranged wife. On January 17th, there was a video that leaked that showed 2 instances of Tim being violent towards his dog. Now, domestic abuse and attempting to hire someone to kill your wife is one thing, but abusing a dog? That's just unforgivable. Okay, I'm being a little facetious there, but let me cook real quick. But on a serious note, I won't show these 2 clips, but I'll describe what happened. The first clip shows Tim dog for getting in his way, while the second clip shows Tim dog while flexing towards it, while the dog cowers away in fear, which was just disgusting to watch. While most people were done with him when the leaks came out back in November, a defenseless animal is just horrible, and now I really don't see how Tim could recover from this. But following this new batch of leaked videos, on the same day, Tim's estranged wife, Dany Ciara, would speak out, saying that she is done with being silent. The headlines on multiple publications reads, "The abusive, cheating, narcissist will try to destroy your life." I'll link her full statement in the description below, but to summarize what was said, she explains that she was not the one who leaked any of the videos of Tim Lambesis from November and January. She also says whoever's doing so should stop. Dany says, quote, "I will no longer be silent out of fear of Tim. The lies being told by him in his statement and in his recent podcast are deliberate attempts to cover up the truth and play the victim using typical Darvo tactics." Now, Darvo tactics are defined as deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender, which is a reaction that perpetrators of wrongdoing may display in response to being held accountable for their behavior. She claims that Tim never launched a domestic investigation against her or filed a restraining order either. She also explains in her statement that the instances that Tim claims was abuse was actually self-defense of repeated physical and mental abuse, as well as repeated infidelity. She goes on to explain, quote, "Tim has continuously tried to intimidate me, bribe me, and beg me to sign an NDA in our marriage settlement, stating that I will never publicly talk about him, so that the truth will be buried when our divorce is finalized," which are all recorded conversations. I also have a recorded phone call from Tim a week ago, rationalizing and explaining why he thinks we should get back together, which I personally do think adds up, as Tim and his second wife got quietly divorced back in 2020, and she was his partner throughout the chaos that was the murder for hire case. But anyways, she then says in her statement that there is Tim's version of events as to why his bandmates left, and then there's the truth, and that there's no irony as to why as I lay dying falling apart coincided with the dissolution of their marriage. She ends off her statement by saying, quote, "The abusive, cheating, narcissist will try to destroy your life and your name with lies. Before you can shine light on the truth, I am done being silent." It is clear that Tim was attempting to save his image through tactics like spreading lies, coercion, and intimidation. If there was any doubt that Tim was abusive, it seems that this has sealed his fate. But following the leaked videos and Dany's statement, publications within the metal community started to share their opinions and even drop op-ed articles. Metal Injection would come out with an article titled "Not Another Redemption Arc for Tim Lambesis," where they share a brief history of Tim's wrongdoings and terrible actions, as well as expressing why they feel that another redemption arc is impossible for Tim. Importantly, the writer of this article would point out that repentance is important, and while he did something horrible, he served his time and his bandmates did forgive him, as well as stating that they don't take pleasure in reporting his horrible actions, but this is the job of journalism sometimes. Lastly, they'll end off their article by saying, "A single redemption arc is fine. A second one feels like a stretch that frankly I have no interest in participating in. Best of luck to Lambesis and whatever musicians decide they want to be a part of that band." Metal Sucks would also share their opinion in their article on the most recent batch of leaked videos, where they said, quote, "How many chances are we as a community gonna give this guy when he's proven himself to be a danger to others, when he's proven he can't work well with others at all, and now he's shown that he's craven enough to strike his own dog? What more do we need to learn about this guy?" The writer goes on to say, quote, "The dude needs to get help and to actively seek to become a better person, yet it's apparent he's either not putting in the work or doesn't care to. Until we see him actively doing that, we as a metal community need to walk away from whatever he does." Although my conclusion was recorded before these recent developments, I do want to say that it's clear that Tim has a long history of volatility, wrongdoings, and terrible actions in his personal life that have spilled over into his professional life. While in my conclusion I stated that he may not be able to recover from this, with these new developments, it is likely, without the support of our community and with multiple instances of abuse, this may spell the end of Tim Lambesis and As I Lay Dying. Tim Lambesis was someone from an early age who was raised Christian and never questioned his faith. He had a deep love for music and decided to drop out of college to put his all into music while he was still young, just to see what happened. While not having a stable lineup, Tim had a clear vision for his band, As I Lay Dying, and early on they showed promise, even if they wore their influences on their sleeve. Eventually, the band adopted a more dynamic and varied take on metalcore, so this would get them noticed by Metal Blade Records. This was where As I Lay Dying became at the forefront of the new wave of metalcore, alongside bands like Killswitch Engage, All That Remains, Unearth, and Darkest Hour. The band would reach the highest of highs of being in a successful metal band as they sold millions of copies of their albums, headline tours, festivals, and Tim's dream of being a full-time musician would be realized. But studying theology in school would shake the foundation of Tim's worldview, and for the first time in his life, he questioned his faith that he wrote about in his music, with Tim saying in his own words, quote, "When you base your whole life around because God told me so, what do you do when that's no longer your worldview?" This mixed with Tim becoming obsessed with fitness, even taking steroids, which is known for having negative side effects, would see Tim devolve in his personal life. This would affect his marriage, and while Tim was going through a bitter divorce, he attempted to hire a hitman to kill his wife. But this hitman was really a cop, and he was then caught. This would deeply affect the rest of his personal relationships, and he eventually pled guilty and served 2.5 years in prison. In spite of Tim's selfish and almost irreversible actions, somehow his band was able to make a comeback as Tim made strides in his personal life that many saw as positive changes. This would not last very long, as in late 2024, slowly every member of As I Lay Dying left the band, as they cited ongoing issues and an unhealthy environment as their reasons for leaving. To make things worse for him, 2 videos leaked that showed a clear toxic and borderline abusive dynamic in his marriage. After this, much of metal was done with Tim and his antics, but bizarrely, Tim would accuse his wife of being the abusive one. For a while, people really thought Tim was a changed man, and as of right now, there aren't any more details surrounding the incident that made up much of the rollout for Through Storms Ahead. So simply, we will have to see the story unfold in real time, but there's a possibility that he undid the years of work he did to rebuild his reputation and won't be able to recover from this.